After more than 10 years in U.S. prisons, 5 Cuban intelligence agents, known collectively as the Cuban Five, have received shocking new information regarding their trial and conviction.
For the first time today, we are revealing the payments made to the Miami journalists by the Office of Cuba Broadcasting and the Broadcasting Board of Governors through Radio and TV Martí during the time of the Cuban Five's detention and trial. What makes the secret payment so egregious is that they were made by the same government that was prosecuting the 5 Cubans.
The 5 were arrested in 1998 and convicted in 2001 on a series of charges and given lengthy prison sentences. They maintained that they were spying not on the U.S. government, but on Cuban exile terrorist groups based in Miami. The convictions were controversial due to a perceived lack of evidence and the severity of the sentences. These were joined by concerns that the trial should have never taken place in Miami, home to the world's largest anti-Castro Cuban exile community. Today, the fate of the 5 stands intertwined with another famous Miami controversy. In 2006, Miami Herald journalist Oscar Corral broke a page 1 story that at least 10 Miami-based journalists were accepting payments from the U.S. government without disclosing those payments to their audiences at their independent outlets. The payments came from Radio and TV Martí, 2 stations that the U.S. broadcasts into Cuba with the stated goal of promoting a free and open society. The Broadcasting Board of Governors, or BBG, is the agency under the U.S. State Department that oversees the roughly $40 million budget to the Martí programs.
There's nothing irregular in our hiring independent journalists. This is an industry norm to have people paid a modest fee for contributing to on-air programs. There's nothing that we're trying to hide, and all of that was for on-air contributions. It was unrelated to any domestic coverage.
Professor on media ethics and law at the University of Minnesota, Jane Kirtley, followed the story closely when it broke in 2006.
The separation between the government and the press in the United States traditionally has been pretty absolute, and particularly when you're talking about something like Radio Martí, which is, the government itself would say, a propaganda arm, that's simply not an appropriate role for journalists to play.
The story resulted in the immediate firings of 3 reporters at the Miami Herald's Spanish-language sister paper, El Nuevo Herald. But after loud protests by the Cuban exile community in Miami, the publisher of both papers was forced to resign, and the 3 reporters were rehired. This baffled many outside of Miami.
The Cuban-American community in South Florida, at least a good chunk of them, are comfortable with this idea of reporters and commentators working both for independent news organizations and for the government. In many respects, they view their role as advocates as opposed to disinterested independent journalists. They think part of their mission is to try to help in undermining the communist regime in Cuba.
4 years since the fallout, and new information shows that the payments go back to at least the arrest and trial of the Cuban Five. During the trial, the defense repeatedly asked for a change of venue, and though it was a decade before these government payments would be known, they cited the lopsided local media coverage as a reason for the change. Their requests were denied.
Imagine if during the trial's beginning, when the defense was seeking a change of venue, if this fact of government-paid journalists who had been covering for 26 months before the trial, hostile coverage. Imagine if the defense had known. Does anyone really believe that the trial would have taken place in Miami? Or even
Salvador Capote, writing for the Cuban government-affiliated Cuba Debate site, counted 806 articles related to the case in El Nuevo Herald, of which he classified 0 as positive. At least 239 of the articles were written by recipients of government payments, including 96 by Pablo Alfonso, who received at least $58,000 in government funds between the Five's arrest and conviction, by far the most of anyone.
Wilfredo Cancio Isla was a reporter for El Nuevo Herald, the newspaper with the highest Spanish language distribution in Miami. He received $4,725 from September 30th, 2000 to December 3rd, 2001, part of the period of the prosecution of the Five. Keep in mind that the jury was not sequestered. So on June 4th, 2001, the very day that the jury began its deliberation, on the question of guilt or innocence, Wilfredo Cancios Isla appeared in El Nuevo Herald with the headline, "Cuba used hallucinogens to train its spies." This article claims from an unnamed source, a supposed Cuban spy defector, that Cuba gives its spies LSD or other hallucinogens in order to train them for missions abroad, as if to imply, by mentioning the five in an article about hallucinogens, that the five were given drugs to control their minds.
For more than a year, the Committee to Free the Cuban Five has been demanding to see the contracts that the government signed with these journalists. The Partnership for Civil Justice is representing the committee in these Freedom of Information proceedings.
This is conduct by the Broadcasting Board of Governors through its Office of Cuban Broadcasting that violates domestic law in the United States, that violates the Smith-Mundt Act, under which the U.S. government may not seek to propagandize the domestic population of the United States.
Recent law school graduate Jeremy Berkowitz is one of very few people to have written about the Smith-Mundt Act. He believes that the contracts will need to be seen before a legal violation can be proven.
If there is evidence that's revealed that could show that there were specific ties between government payments and these journalists writing specific articles on certain topics, then there could potentially be a violation of the Smith-Mundt Act.
We have gone into court to demand these records. We have filed federal litigation. They will not turn them over. Why are they withholding the contracts? Withholding the contracts makes it clear that the government is now engaged in a cover-up of these operations that are being exposed.
The BBG denies the cover-up claims.
I can assure you that as an agency, we are very mindful of our FOIA obligations and are happy to fulfill them. So we are not trying to complicate things.
The BBG's legal filings cite procedural errors on the part of the Committee to Free the Five as the reason for not disclosing the contracts.
Well, it's not very difficult to withhold information when someone makes a FOIA request.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, has taken a keen interest in the case of the Cuban Five.
I'm sure that throughout the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, there are those who labor away every day to fulfill the letter of the law and the spirit of the law with regard to the Freedom of Information Act. But I also know there are people at the highest levels who know how to thwart, or at least thwart for a time, the requirements of that act. And you do it by simply obfuscating, you do it by demanding ever more specific information because you can't find the information that they're looking for.
The lawyer in the Freedom of Information case, Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, admits that they have low expectations for the contracts.
Although, realistically, would we expect that the U.S. government would write, dear sir, we're writing you a contract for you to illegally propagandize the domestic public? I don't think so. I think what they do, they pay people, people write articles, people have interest in writing articles, they receive cash, and at no point they disclose they're on the payroll of the U.S. government.
The timing of the paid-for journalism suggests a concerted plan existed to taint the judicial proceedings and to tilt the outcome of the trial toward guilty verdicts, depriving the defendants of our cherished Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial by an impartial jury.
The convictions were already overturned once on appeal back in 2005.
The 11th Circuit three-judge panel cited the legal standard of, quote, inflammatory, prejudicial pretrial publicity that so pervades or saturates the community as to render virtually impossible a fair trial.
The Attorney General at the time, Alberto Gonzalez, appealed that decision and the convictions were reinstated. All this took place before the payments to journalists were discovered. Trial lawyer for the Five, Leonard Weinglass, believes that the law is on their side.
Government agents are obligated not to do anything that will increase the prejudice in the venue. And you read the articles that were put out by these individuals who are being paid by the government. These articles are very damning of the Five and certainly increase the prejudice in the community.
The U.S. Attorney's Office in South Florida, who originally prosecuted the Five, denied to comment on the demand for a retrial. On Monday, June 14th, one of the Five, Gerardo Hernandez, who is serving 2 life sentences plus 15 years, will be in court again to demand the convictions be overturned. Come back for part 2 when we look into the politics that surround the case of the Cuban Five.